The bowl was warm in my hands. Steam curled from the surface of the kanji in slow, lazy ribbons, carrying the scent of ginger and something else. Something faintly medicinal, almost sweet, the way things that will kill you often are. I stood in the pale gray light of early morning, in a bedchamber I had never seen before, wearing robes I did not recognize, holding a bowl of poisoned rice porridge intended for a 7-year-old boy. And I remembered everything. Not my own memories. Those were fragments, dim and waterlogged, the remnants of a woman named Shen Yuhei Hua, who had been Empress of the Honghua dynasty and spent 3 years being quietly, systematically destroyed by the court around her. No, what I remembered with perfect, merciless clarity were the memories of my previous life. 28 years as an ordinary woman in an ordinary city, reading historical romance novels on my phone, falling asleep mid-chapter, and apparently dying in the process. Because here I was, transmigrated, into the body of the villain. I set the bowl down on the lacquered table. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. I know, now, what it means to read thousands of pages of exactly this scenario. I know the genre. I know the rules. The transmigrated villain who continues on the original soul's path dies in the second act, usually badly, usually publicly, with the entire court watching. The one who pivots, who thinks, who chooses differently, that is the one who survives. I looked at the bowl. Then I looked around the room I had woken in. It was the Zelan courtyard, the most remote and neglected wing of the Crimson Phoenix Palace. I knew this from the memories I had inherited, soft and chaotic as they were. The Empress's official residence should have been the Fenwang Hall, all carved eaves and gold-leafed phoenixes. Instead, Shen Yuhei Hua had been relocated here 6 months after the emperor's favor had shifted, relocated with 2 aging handmaidens, a damp stone floor in the eastern annex, and the expectation that she would quietly cease to matter. The walls were cracked. The bronze braziers had not been refilled properly in days. The coals were nearly gray. In the corner, a small folding screen was painted with peonies that had faded to the color of old paper. The Empress of the Honghua dynasty lived like a woman the palace had already begun to forget. And in 1 hour, if I had followed the original soul's plan, a small boy in the adjacent courtyard would have drunk this bowl of kanji and been dead before the morning assembly bells rang. I picked up the bowl and walked to the window. I opened it. I poured the entire contents into the drainage channel below, watching it seep away between the stones. Then I put the bowl back on the table, sat down on the edge of the low bed, and began to think. Here is what I knew from the fractured memories of Shen Yuhei Hua, assembled the way you piece together a broken vase on a table, not whole, but the shape of it clearly enough. She had been beautiful, ambitious, the daughter of a minor noble house elevated beyond her station when the old emperor chose her from a selection ceremony at 17. She had believed for exactly as long as it takes a 17-year-old to be told something often enough that her beauty was her power. She had not understood that beauty is only power in the hands of someone who controls what others see. In the Honghua court, that control had never belonged to her. 3 years into her marriage, the emperor had found consort Rong Mei Lian. Consort Rong was the daughter of the Minister of Revenue. She had a face like a painting of a crane, elegant, distant, carefully constructed, and a mind like a documents archive, cross-referenced and relentless. She understood from the first day she entered the palace that the path to permanence ran through the Empress's destruction, and she set about it with the patience of someone planting a garden she intended to walk in for decades.
She had fed Shen Yuhei jealousy like grain to a fish, small comments, whispered reports, exaggerated slights. She had arranged for Yuhei to hear, at carefully chosen moments, what the emperor said when he thought no one was listening. She had placed allies in Yuhei inner circle as handmaidens. She had, over the course of 2 years, transformed a vain and frightened young woman into a creature of spite and paranoia, and then stood back and watched Yuhei do the rest to the damage to herself. Crown Prince Shao Changjin was the legitimate heir, born of the previous empress who had died in childbirth. As long as he lived, Consort Rong's own son, the second prince, Shao Changyu, 4 years old and already draped in gifts, could not inherit. Yuhei had been persuaded, through careful degrees of suggestion, that eliminating the crown prince would secure her own position, that the emperor would have no choice but to rely on her, that she would finally matter. She had been wrong about everything except the fact that she was already out of time. What Consort Rong had not shared, what I found buried in Yuhei memories, like a stone at the bottom of a still pond, was that the poison in the bowl had not come from Yuhei own resources. It had been sourced through one of Consort Rong's pharmacy contacts and delivered to Yuhei chambers by a handmaiden who reported to no one but Consort Rong. If Chang Jin had died this morning, every thread of evidence would have led directly and exclusively
to the Empress. Consort Rong would have stood at the emperor's side, grief-stricken, impeccable, and watched Yuehua dragged to the execution ground. Shen Yuehua had been the blade all along. She had simply not known who was holding the handle. I sat with this knowledge for a long moment in the cold gray quiet of the Zilan courtyard. Then I stood, smoothed my robes, and called for my handmaiden. Her name was Chun Mei. She was 17, with a round face and careful eyes that watched me the moment I emerged from the bedchamber with an expression I could only describe as braced. She was waiting to see which version of the Empress had woken up today, the cold one or the furious one. I gave her neither. "Bring me fresh congee," I said. "Plain, no additions." I watched her carefully when I said it. Her eyes flickered, just barely, toward the table where the empty bowl sat, then back to my face. "This servant will attend to it immediately, Your Majesty. And send word to the Crown Prince's courtyard that I will visit him this morning." A silence, not long. A breath, maybe, 2, but full. "The Crown Prince, Your Majesty." "Is there another Crown Prince I am not aware of?" I said this pleasantly. I had read enough of these novels to know that the recovered villain's first public act sets the entire tone of the story that follows. Calm, slightly amused, immovable. "Tell his attendants to prepare. I will come after the morning assembly." Chun Mei bowed and retreated. I turned back to the window and looked out at the pale sky above the palace walls, the roof tiles dark with overnight frost, the distant sound of bells beginning their first sequence of the morning. Somewhere in this enormous, treacherous structure, a 7-year-old was waking up without knowing that his breakfast had just been changed. I had transmigrated into a story I had never read, but I knew the shape of it, and I intended to change the ending. I should describe the Wrong Phoenix Palace the way you would describe anything you are learning to navigate, not as someone who belongs to it, but as someone who is mapping it in order to survive it. It was built on 3 concentric rings. The outermost contained the administrative halls and the residences of the lower officials. The middle ring held the residences of the imperial family, the consorts' quarters arranged by rank in a progression that made their hierarchy as legible as a seating chart, each courtyard either slightly larger or slightly better maintained than the one beside it. The innermost ring was the emperor's private quarters, the Hall of 10,000 Ancestors, and the Jade Dragon Court where morning assembly was held. The Crimson Phoenix Palace, where I resided, was technically within the middle ring. In practice, it was as far from the emperor as it was possible to be while still being classified as his wife.
This distance, I was beginning to understand, was an advantage. No one was watching the Zelon courtyard. No one had watched it in months. Whatever I did here, I would be doing it largely unseen. And in a court built on the performance of visibility, invisibility was a resource most people did not think to use. I ate my plain congee. I dressed carefully, not in the most elaborate of the Empress's robes, which smelled of a woman trying too hard, but in a simpler set, dark plum silk with silver thread at the cuffs, the phoenix hairpiece that signaled rank without announcing desperation. I wore no excessive jewelry. I let my face be plain and controlled. Then I walked to the Crown Prince's courtyard. Xiao Cheng-jin was sitting at a low writing table when I arrived, a brush in his hand and a sheet of practice calligraphy in front of him that he was clearly not looking at. He was looking at the door. He had been looking at the door since the moment my arrival was announced, and the expression on his face when I walked through it was one I recognized from the memories of his stepmother. He was waiting for the cruelty to begin. He was very small. I had known he was 7 years old, but knowing and seeing are different things. He had the late Empress's coloring, which the court held against him in the subtle way courts hold things against people they cannot openly criticize. Dark eyes, a slight and serious face, posture so carefully correct it looked like effort. He had been taught by 3 years of calculated neglect and a stepmother who had never looked at him with anything but cold resentment to make himself as small as possible. I sat down across from him.
He did not move. "Let me see your calligraphy," I said. He pushed the sheet toward me with both hands, head slightly bowed. The characters were neat. Better than neat. The brushwork had a quality that surprised me, a lightness in the downstrokes that suggested someone who practiced not because they were told, but because the act of it was, on some level, a comfort. "Who taught you?" I asked. A pause. He was waiting for the trap in the question. "Imperial Tutor Shen, Your Imperial Highness." His voice was formal and very quiet. The honorific he used for me was the correct one, precisely correct, neither warm nor disrespectful. He was 7 years old and already fluent in the grammar of survival. "He taught you well," I said. I set the paper back on the table. "Cheng-jin." Another pause. I had used his name. Not a title, not an address. His name. I watched him process this. "Yes, Your Imperial Highness." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I owe you an apology." The silence that followed was profound. He stared at me with the large, careful eyes of a child who has learned not to react to anything, because reaction is dangerous, and I watched something shift in them. Confusion, mostly, and the particular wariness of a person who has been offered something before only to have it used against them. I did not elaborate. An apology without explanation was, for now, enough. More than enough, because an explanation would have required me to tell him things he was too young to carry. I would explain someday, when he was older, when the ground beneath him was more stable. For now, I simply let the words sit between us and watched him not know what to do with them. "This month," I said, "I will begin attending your morning lessons." He blinked. "Your Imperial Highness wishes to attend. You are the Crown Prince of the Honghua dynasty. Your education is an imperial matter. I have been neglectful of it." I paused. "I will not be neglectful of it going forward." I stayed for half an hour. I did not say anything else of great consequence. I drank the tea his attendant brought. I asked him about the texts he was studying. I listened to his answers, careful, measured, the answers of a child who had learned to give as little as possible, and I simply stayed and did not leave, and did not hurt him, and let the novelty of that settle around us, like snow. When I rose to go, he stood and bowed in the formal manner. Then, just as I reached the door, he said, quietly, without looking up, "Thank you for coming, Your Imperial Highness." I did not turn around. I did not want him to see my expression. Outside, in the corridor, I breathed slowly and steadied myself. I had transmigrated into a woman who had nearly murdered this child, and I had approximately, by my estimation, 6 months before consort Wrong's next move. Because a woman who had invested 3 years in building a blade would not simply discard it. When Yue Hua failed to deliver results, consort Wrong would shift strategies. She would look for another tool, or she would begin dismantling what remained of the Empress's position directly. 6 months to make Cheng Jin untouchable. 6 months to become someone no one in this court had prepared for. I walked back through the frost-quiet corridors of the Crimson Phoenix Palace and began, in the quiet of my own thoughts, to plan. The first thing I did was make a list. Not on paper. Paper in the Honghua court was not a private medium. Handmaidens could read, ladies-in-waiting could carry messages, attendants could be bribed. I made the list in my head, lying awake on my first night in the Xilan courtyard, with the brazier burning low and the sound of the wind against the cracked walls. What I had: the title of Empress, the residence I was in, 2 handmaidens, one of whom reported to consort Wrong, a crown prince who had not yet decided to trust me, a reputation as a vicious and unstable woman that would work either against me or, if I handled it correctly, as a kind of armor, because people do not look carefully at someone they have already categorized. What I needed: allies, information, money, and time. I began with information, because information was the cheapest resource available to a woman who was willing to sit quietly and listen. I started with Chan Mei. Not by confronting her. That was the old Yue Hua's approach, and it had served her about as well as everything else the old Yue Hua had tried. Instead, over the following 2 weeks, I observed. I noted which questions made Chun Mei's movements become slightly too precise. I noted that she burned the paper liners from the incense holders, a mundane task, but done with a thoroughness that suggested habit, not thoroughness. I noted that once, when she thought I was asleep, she stood at the window of the outer chamber and looked in the direction of Consort Wrong's Mingju Pavilion for a long, long moment. On the 15th day, I called her in and asked her to sit down. She stood. Handmaidens did not sit in the presence of the Empress. I said, "Sit down, Chun Mei," in a tone that left no ambiguity, and she sat, and I could see the fear beginning its slow bloom behind her eyes. "I know what you have been doing," I said. She said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, absolutely still, the stillness of someone who has decided that any movement at all is the wrong movement. "I am not angry," I said. This, I think, frightened her more. "You were given no choice," I continued. "You are 17. You serve at the pleasure of the court, and the court told you to serve 2 masters. Anyone in your position would have done the same." I paused. "I am going to give you a different choice now. You may continue reporting to Consort Wrong's household. I will not stop you. You will, however, report what I tell you to report." Another pause. "Or you may stop reporting to her entirely and serve this household alone, in which case I will ensure that when you leave imperial service at the appropriate age, you have a settlement sufficient to establish yourself comfortably." She stared at me. "Think about it," I said. "Take 3 days. Tell me nothing until you have decided." She left. I waited. On the 2nd day, she came back. "This servant chooses the 2nd path," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "If your Majesty will truly honor the promise, I will write it and seal it tonight." It was the first seal I used in the Xilan courtyard. I looked at the Empress's phoenix seal for a long time before I pressed it into the wax, the seal of a woman the court was waiting to forget, and I thought, not yet, not yet. The second resource I needed was Cheng Jin's trust, and that could not be bought or strategized. It had to be built, slowly, the way all real things are built, by showing up, consistently, over time, and not being the person they expected. I came to his morning lessons every day. I sat at the back of the room at first, not participating, just present.
A body in the room that did not loom, did not punish, did not require anything. His tutor, imperial scholar Gu Ming-feng, an old man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of blinking very slowly when he disapproved of something, watched me with approximately the expression of a man who has seen many strange things in 30 years of court service and has learned not to trust them, any of them. On the second week, I began to ask questions, small ones, the kind that directed the lesson rather than derailed it, and that required Cheng Jin to think rather than recite. He was quick, sharper than the tutoring he had given him room to demonstrate. The rote learning of classical texts is not a method that reveals a child's mind, and his mind was worth revealing. At the end of the third week, after the lesson ended, Cheng Jin stayed at his table, after the tutor had bowed and retreated. He was pretending to review his texts. He was not reviewing his texts. I stayed too. After a while, he said, without looking up, Imperial scholar Gu says the Yangtze River flooded 14 times in the reign of Emperor Kaizong. It flooded 11 times, I said. Scholar Gu has misremembered. The figure of 14 applies to the total number of major waterway crises, including 2 tributary collapses, but those are generally not classified as Yangtze floods in the primary records. A pause. "How does your Imperial Highness know this?" he asked. He was looking at me. "I had a great deal of time to read," I said. This, in a different sense than he understood, was entirely true. He considered this. Then, "The flooding question is on the spring exam." "I know. Scholar Gu will mark the answer of 14 as correct. Then Scholar Gu will be correcting children to believe a misremembered figure for another decade," I said. "You may answer 11 and explain the distinction between primary and tributary incidents. The examiner will either recognize the nuance and reward it, or he will not, and you will know something about the examiner."
Cheng Jin looked at me for a long moment with those serious, careful eyes. Then, so quickly I almost missed it, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the memory of the possibility of one, but it was there. 6 weeks into my new life in the Zilong courtyard, I met Lao Feng. He was head eunuch of the inner palace, one of the oldest and most senior figures in the court's administrative structure, a man who had served 3 emperors and who moved through the palace's corridors with the quiet omniscience of someone who had been rendered invisible by sheer familiarity. He arrived at my courtyard on a gray afternoon unannounced, bearing a small lacquered box of dried longan fruit from the imperial kitchens. "A gift from the kitchens, in honor of the Empress's continued good health," he said. His voice was smooth and entirely neutral. I looked at the box, then at him. His face was a court face, readable as a wall. He was perhaps 60, with deep-set eyes, and the particular composure of a person who has spent a lifetime in the company of powerful and unstable people, and has learned that the only safe expression is no expression at all. I did not know what he wanted. I did not know whose side he was on. The memories I had inherited from Yue Hua contained almost nothing about Lao Feng. He had moved too quietly for her chaos to catch him. "Thank Supervisor Chen for his thoughtfulness," I said, naming the kitchen supervisor. Something in Lao Feng's expression shifted by approximately 1 degree, so small that in any other context I would have called it nothing. But I had been watching faces for 6 weeks in a court where faces were the only documents that mattered, and I caught it. I had said the wrong name. The dried longan had not come from Supervisor Chen. It had come from Lao Feng himself. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, and left. I sat with the box of longan fruit for a long time, ate one. Sweet, clean, no aftertaste, not poisoned, I had no rational reason to believe it was poisoned, and an abundance of genre-trained reasons to understand that if Lao Feng wanted me dead, there were dozens of more elegant ways. He had come to look at me. He had brought a gift in someone else's name to see if I knew enough to catch the misdirection. I did not know yet what he was testing me for, but I knew it was a test. And I had a feeling, the particular instinct of a person who has read enough stories to recognize a plot thread, that Lao Fang would come back. He came back on a night 3 weeks later, when the first autumn cold had moved into the palace and the lanterns in the corridor were burning low. This time he came alone, after the handmaidens had been sent to the outer room, and he did not bring a gift. He simply stood in the doorway of my chamber and looked at me, with those deep-set eyes that had seen 3 emperors come and go, and he said, with no preamble whatsoever, "You are not the same woman." I looked at him. People change. In 6 weeks? When the reason is sufficient. Another long silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees in the courtyard. Somewhere distant, a palace bell marked the hour. The late Empress, he meant Cheng Jin's mother, the previous Empress who had died, asked me before she died to watch over her son. I have done so in the ways available to me. The ways available to a eunuch of the inner palace are limited. They do not include preventing an empress from poisoning the morning congee. He said this without inflection, simply, here is a fact. But they did include ensuring the congee was slightly delayed in reaching the kitchen that morning. The boy was at his calligraphy when you woke. He had not yet eaten. I held very still. He continued, "The poison would have taken 4 hours. You had a window of approximately half an hour before the bowl would have been brought to him. I gave you that window by slowing the morning routine by 45 minutes. I said nothing for a moment. Then, "You knew I would change my mind." "I did not know," Lao Feng said. "I hoped. Something in the way you had been moving through this courtyard in the days before. There was a quality to it that the previous empress did not possess. A stillness." He paused. "Also, you stopped wearing the kingfisher hairpiece. She wore it every day for 3 years. You have not touched it." I looked at him. He looked at me. "What do you want?" I asked. "What the late empress asked of me," he said. "For her son to live, for her son to reign, for the people who are trying to destroy him to receive, in time, what they have earned." A pause. "I am old, I am patient, and I know things about this court that are not written in any document." He folded his hands in front of him. "I would like, Your Majesty, to be useful." I thought of Consort Rong in her Mingju pavilion, surrounded by allies and dressed in the emperor's favor. I thought of Chancellor Wei Boming, who had helped build the architecture of Yehua's destruction without ever leaving a fingerprint. I thought of Cheng Jin, 7 years old, sitting at his writing table, practicing characters that kept his hands busy so he did not have to think about how afraid he was. "Tell me," I said, "everything." Lao Feng sat down, which was not something head eunuchs generally did in the presence of the empress. He sat down, and he began to talk, and I listened, and the lanterns burned lower, and outside the pine trees moved in the autumn wind, and somewhere in the palace a small boy slept, not knowing how many people were in that moment deciding his future. I listened to all of it. And then I began, quietly and without announcement, to build the thing that would take Consort Rong apart, piece by piece, not in anger, not in haste, but with the patience of someone who knows exactly how the story ends and is simply taking care to get each step right. I had transmigrated into a wicked stepmother. I intended to make something else of it entirely. What Lao Feng told me that night took 3 hours to tell and several days to fully absorb. He began with the late empress, whose name had been Shao Ne Ron, Ron Wen Shu, the only daughter of a general from the northern frontier, a woman who had entered the palace at 19 with the posture of someone accustomed to cold weather and difficult terrain. She had been, by all accounts Lao Feng possessed, a person of considerable intelligence and no illusions. She had known from the beginning that the court did not want a general's daughter on the phoenix throne. She had known that her son would be a target the moment he drew his first breath. And so she had prepared, in the methodical way of a woman raised in a garrison rather than a garden, for the possibility that she would not be there to protect him.
She had sewn a jade token into the inner lining of Cheng Jin's winter robe, a particular robe, the one embroidered with golden pheasants at the cuffs, that she had made with her own hands in the last month of her pregnancy. The token was small, flat, carved with the seal of the old emperor's personal signet and accompanied by a document, folded to the size of a thumbnail and wrapped in oilcloth, that constituted a blood oath of succession made between the old emperor and the general, Ran Wenshu's father, at the end of the northern campaign. The oath guaranteed that a child of the general's line, if that child held imperial blood, would be recognized as the legitimate heir by the full ancestral council of the clan. No emperor could depose such a child without triggering a succession crisis that would split the clan aristocracy in half. Cheng Jin had worn that robe every winter for 3 years without knowing what was sewn into it. Lao Feng had known. He had been present when Ran Wenshu sewed it. She had trusted him with it because he was the only person in the palace whose loyalty was not purchasable. Not because he was incorruptible by nature, but because the thing Consort Rong would have needed to offer him was the one thing she could not provide, a promise that Ran Wenshu's son would be safe. Lao Feng had made that promise to a dying woman and intended to keep it. Consort Rong's gold meant nothing to a man who had already decided what he was willing to die for. He told me this without sentimentality, in the flat, precise manner of a man recounting logistics. I listened to all of it, and then I said, "Does Cheng Jin know about the token?" "No." "Good," I said. "He will not know until he needs to. Children who know they carry weapons have a tendency to reach for them too early." I paused. "Consort Rong, does she know about the oath?" "She knows a document exists, she has not been able to find it. 3 of her people have gone through the late Empress's effects over the past 3 years, Lao Feng said. They did not think to look inside a child's winter robe. I sat with this for a moment. "Then we do not use it yet," I said. "We use it exactly once, at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right witnesses. Before that moment, it does not exist." Lao Feng looked at me with his deep-set eyes. "You are," he said slowly, "quite different from her." "Yes, I am."
I will not claim the months that followed were easy. They were not. They were the kind of difficult that does not announce itself dramatically. No single catastrophe, no obvious crisis. Just the sustained, grinding difficulty of operating inside a system designed to make you fail, while appearing not to be operating at all. I moved carefully. I moved slowly. I did exactly what a woman in my position was expected to do, which is to say, almost nothing, while doing, beneath that surface of almost nothing, a great deal. Lao Feng was my eyes in the parts of the palace I could not reach. He told me when Consort Rong held her private gatherings, which officials attended, what gifts were exchanged, when Chancellor Wei Boming's sedan chair arrived at the Mingzhu Pavilion's side entrance after dark. He told me the state of the second prince's household finances, extravagant, maintained through a network of tributary gifts from officials who were essentially paying for future favor. He told me that the emperor visited Consort Rong's pavilion on average 5 nights out of 7, and that on the 2 nights he did not, he sat in the Hall of 10,000 Ancestors alone, which Lao Feng said was something he had begun doing in the year after Ruan Wenshu died. This last detail I filed away carefully. A man who sits alone in the Hall of Ancestors is a man with something on his conscience. That was not nothing. Chunmei, true to her word, had stopped reporting to Consort Rong's household. In her place, because Consort Rong was not the kind of woman to simply let a resource go dark, a new handmaiden was assigned to my courtyard through the general household rotation. Her name was Ai Lian. She was pleasant, efficient, and reported everything she observed to the Mingzhu Pavilion within 24 hours. I knew this because Lao Feng told me. I let Ai Lian observe everything I wanted Consort Rong to know, my domestic routine, my attendance at Cheng Jin's lessons. I allowed this to appear as the harmless eccentricity of an empress with nothing else to occupy herself. my occasional walks in the less trafficked corridors of the middle ring, my reading, my embroidery, which I had taken up with apparent dedication and at which I was genuinely terrible, a fact I found useful because a woman who is bad at embroidery seems occupied rather than dangerous. What Ailian did not observe was the correspondence. I had written, through channels Lao Fang provided, to 3 people outside the palace. The first was an archivist at the Imperial Records Bureau, a former student of scholar Gu Mingfeng who trusted the old tutor's recommendation and was willing, for consideration, to pull certain historical documents for review. The second was a merchant in the Eastern Market District who dealt in medicinal supplies, and who had, according to Lao Fang, sold several unusual compounds to a buyer associated with Consort Rong's household over the past 2 years. I did not contact this merchant directly. I simply ensured, through a chain of 3 intermediaries, that his records were copied and held somewhere safe. The third letter was to Cheng Jin's maternal uncle, General Ruan Cheng Hao, the younger brother of the late Empress, currently stationed at the northern frontier. This letter I wrote myself, in the late Empress's calligraphy style, which I had spent 4 weeks practicing until it was close enough for a man who had not seen his sister's handwriting in 3 years to accept without question. In the letter, I simply said, "Your nephew is well. He is being looked after. Be ready when you are called." I sealed it with a secondary seal, one of several I had found in Yue Hua's abandoned document chest, a personal seal, rather than the Empress's official one, and sent it north with a courier whose loyalty Lao Feng had maintained for a decade. Then I went back to my embroidery and waited. Cheng Jin turned 8 2 months into this period, and I arranged a small observance in the Zilan courtyard, not the lavish banquet that the Crown Prince's birthday nominally warranted, because lavish was not yet available to me, and overreach would have been immediately visible, but something. A table in the courtyard with autumn persimmons, a set of new brushes, and an inkstone of a quality that was not excessive but was genuinely good. Scholar Gu Mingfeng came, slightly suspicious, increasingly less so. Lao Feng came, bearing a message from the kitchen which was actually from himself. I came. Cheng Jin sat at the head of his small table and looked at the persimmons and the brushes with the expression of a child who has learned to hold very still when presented with something good, because stillness is less likely to cause it to be taken away. "These are yours," I said. "No one is going to take them." He looked at me. Then he picked up one of the brushes and turned them in his hands, slowly, the way you handle something that matters. "The bristles are wolf hair, for fine work. You knew that from looking at them?" My mother told me about brushes. She said a good brush is a reliable thing. It does what you ask of it. I did not say anything. I simply sat with him in the pale autumn sunlight and let him have his persimmons and his brushes and the small, uncomplicated pleasure of a birthday that no one had ruined. Later, when the afternoon had cooled and Scholar Gu had gone, Cheng Jin stood beside me at the edge of the courtyard where the asmanthus tree was shedding its last flowers, and he said, without particular lead-up, "I know you are doing something." I looked at him. "I don't know what it is," he said, "but the Lao Feng comes here now, and you write letters that Chun Mei doesn't see." He was looking at the asmanthus flowers. "I'm not going to tell anyone." He was 8 years old. "No," I said, after a moment. "No, you are not going to tell anyone, and you are also not going to ask me about it. And you are going to go about your lessons and your calligraphy and your spring examination preparation as though everything is entirely ordinary. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Good," I said. "In return, I will tell you one thing. Everything I am doing for you, not for myself, not for anyone else." I paused. "You do not need to trust me yet, but I would like, when the time comes that you are able to verify it, for you to remember that I said so now." He turned and looked at me directly, fully, the way he rarely did, the careful distance dropping for just a moment. "I already trust you," he said. He said it quietly, as though it was a small thing. It was not a small thing.
It was, in that moment, the most significant thing anyone in the Honghua dynasty had said to me. I looked away first, at the ismanthus tree, at the pale sky above the palace walls. "Go inside," I said. "It's getting cold." He went. I stood in the courtyard for a while longer, in the smell of ismanthus and autumn, and I held myself very still until the tightness in my chest resolved into something I could breathe around. Then I went back inside and wrote another letter. The imperial autumn banquet was held on the 20th day of the 9th month in the Hall of 10,000 Ancestors, which was large enough to seat 200 and was arranged in the precise hierarchical geography that court events required, the emperor at the head, consort Rong at his right hand in the seat traditionally reserved for the empress, because the empress had for the past year declined to attend banquets, which was either a symptom of her deterioration or a strategy, and the court had read it as the former. I attended the autumn banquet. I arrived exactly on time, which was not fashionable but was strategic. Early would have seemed eager, late would have seemed chaotic, and exactly on time allowed me to be observed arriving without having to stand and be observed for a prolonged period. I wore deep crimson with the phoenix crown because this was one of the 2 events a year at which the Empress was expected to dress in full ceremonial regalia, and I had decided after 5 months of strategic plainness that this was the moment to remind the court I still held the title. The room noticed. I had expected it to, and I let it, keeping my expression pleasant and perfectly empty. Consort Rong noticed most of all. She was wearing gold, a shade of gold that was technically reserved for imperial consorts on ceremonial occasions, but sat close enough to the Empress's crimson to make a statement about proximity without crossing the explicit line. She was beautiful in the way that well-maintained things are beautiful, the kind of beauty that requires significant infrastructure and makes it look effortless. She watched me cross the hall to my seat, the Empress's seat, the one that had been quietly set to the side in recent seasons, which I had Lao Feng quietly, wordlessly move back to its correct position 2 days before the banquet, and her face showed nothing at all, which is how I knew she was recalibrating. The banquet proceeded through its formal stages. Wine was poured in order of rank, the ceremonial dishes were appreciated and approved. Several officials offered seasonal poems that the emperor received with appropriate gravity. Cheng Jin sat at the table designated for imperial children. There were 4 of them, Cheng Jin, oldest and most contained, consort Rong's son, Cheng Yu, beside him, in robes that probably cost more than the Zilan courtyard's monthly provisions. I ate mine and watched everything and waited. The moment came in the 3rd hour, during the informal period, after the ceremonial dishes, when wine flowed more freely and conversation replaced performance. Lady Chen, a senior court noble who served as one of the imperial household's administrative supervisors, approached the dais with a document and a manner that was apologetic in the way that things are apologetic when they are intended to wound.
"This person begs forgiveness for raising a household matter at such a festive occasion," Lady Chen said, bowing to the emperor, then to consort Rong, then, slightly less deeply, to me. "But the matter has been brought to this person's attention by noble consort Rong's household, and it bears the Empress's seal, and there is some confusion. There is no need for such ceremony," consort Rong said, smoothly, from the emperor's right. She had timed this. I understood that immediately. Lady Chen was her instrument, the banquet her stage, the emperor her audience, and the document whatever she had constructed to be the weapon. The Empress's household submitted a request for a reallocation of the inner palace textile stores, specifically 40 bolts of Suzhou silk that were designated for the second Prince Cheng Yu's winter wardrobe. The reallocation bears the Empress's seal and was processed by the Household Bureau 3 weeks ago. She paused, the pause of a woman allowing a blade to settle. Noble consort Wrong's household notes simply that the silk has not been returned and that the second prince has been without his winter provision. The room was very quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when they are actually very loud. Every eye moved to me. I set down my wine cup. I did not hurry. I let the moment breeze. Let consort Wrong have it. Let her believe the blade had landed. And then I looked at Lady Chen. "I would like to see the document," I said. Lady Chen brought it to me. I opened it. I read it. It was a household reallocation order dated 3 weeks prior, bearing the Empress's phoenix seal in red ink. The calligraphy was competent. The seal impression was accurate. It was also not mine. I had not issued a single household document in 5 months. I had been deliberately, methodically absent from the administrative record, because an empress who issues no orders leaves no paper trail for anyone to manipulate. Everything I had done had moved through Lao Feng's channels, or through verbal instruction. Nothing sealed, nothing submitted, nothing that could be handled and altered by other hands. Whatever bore my seal on that document had been applied by someone with access to an impression of it, and there was only one household that had maintained a spy in my courtyard long enough to have taken such an impression. I looked at the document for another moment, then I looked up at Lady Chen. "Lady Chen, when was this document processed by the Household Bureau?" "The 28th day of the 8th month, Your Majesty." "And the Bureau's record would show the receiving clerk's notation?" "It would, Your Majesty." "I would like then for the Bureau record to be brought here." I said this pleasantly. "Not a copy, the original ledger entry. I believe the Bureau archive is kept in the Eastern Administrative Hall, which is a short walk from this building." I looked at the Emperor. "If His Majesty permits the brief delay, I think the matter will be resolved quite quickly." The Emperor, who was watching this with the expression of a man who did not particularly want to be in the middle of it, nodded. An administrative secretary was dispatched. The hall continued. More wine was poured, conversations resumed at a slightly elevated volume, the particular sound of 200 people pretending not to be paying close attention. Consort Wrong sat at the Emperor's right hand with her pleasant, composed face and her gold robes, and gave absolutely no outward indication that anything unexpected was occurring. I ate a piece of preserved kumquat and waited. The ledger arrived in 40 minutes. The secretary set it on the table before me and opened it to the relevant entry. I read it. Then I turned it so that Lady Chen could read it. Then I said, at a volume calibrated to be clearly audible to the senior officials at the nearest tables. The receiving notation on this entry was made by a clerk designated Inner Household Clerk 7. I paused. Clerk 7 is an administrative position attached to Noble Consort Wrong's pavilion. It is not a position with access to the Empress's household submission channel. Another pause. The document could only have entered the Bureau through Clerk 7's window if it was submitted by someone with access to that window. It could not have come from my household. I set the ledger down. "Lady Chen, I wonder if you might clarify for the assembled company whose household brought this matter to your attention." Lady Chen had gone the particular color of a woman who has realized she has been handed something that is about to explode. "Noble Consort Wrong's household." The words came out smaller than she had intended. "Yes," I said. I looked at Consort Wrong then, for the first time since the exchange had begun. Just looked. Calm, direct, without heat. Consort Wrong looked back at me. Her face was still. Her hands in her lap were still. She was a woman who spent a decade maintaining composure under pressure, and she maintained it.
Now, which I had expected. The composure was the performance. What I was watching for was something underneath it. I found it in her eyes, just briefly, the calculation happening behind them, the rapid reassessment of what I was and what I had become, and how far the gap was between that and what she had expected. I let the silence stand. I did not explain further. I did not accuse. I simply held her gaze for exactly long enough to make the point, and then I looked away, back to Lady Chen, and said, I trust this resolves the confusion. I hope the second prince's winter wardrobe can be sourced from an uncomplicated channel going forward. Then I reached for my wine cup and looked at the emperor and said, pleasantly, does His Majesty enjoy the chrysanthemum wine this year? I find the sweetness slightly heavier than last autumn. The emperor blinked. Then, with the reflexive social competence of a man who has chaired banquets for 15 years, he said, the sweetness varies by harvest. This year's late bloom produced a different yield. Indeed, I said, and we talked about chrysanthemum wine for 6 minutes, while 200 members of the Honghua court attempted to digest what they had just witnessed, and Consort Rong sat at the emperor's right hand in her gold robes and recalibrated everything. Later, when the banquet had ended and the hall had emptied in its careful hierarchical sequence, Lao Feng fell into step beside me in the corridor, at a distance that was professionally appropriate. The Mingju Pavilion's light burned until the 4th watch, he murmured, which meant Consort Rong had not slept. Good, I said. She will move faster now. She knows you are no longer what she built. I know. I walked in silence for a moment through the dark corridor, the lanterns casting their small pools of amber light. Let her move faster. A careful enemy is more dangerous than a frightened one. Frightened people make mistakes. And what do you do while she makes them? I thought of Cheng Jin at his writing table, turning the wolf hair brush in his hands. I thought of a jade token sewn into a winter robe. I thought of a letter traveling north to a general on the frontier. I keep building, I said. There is still a great deal left to build. The mistake Consort Rong made was Chancellor Wei Bo-ming. She made it because she was frightened, and because frightened people reach for their largest instrument rather than their most precise one, and Chancellor Wei Bo-ming was the largest instrument she possessed. He was 60, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, with the particular authority of a man who has held a position long enough that people have ceased to remember what the position was like before him. He controlled the flow of administrative documents through the court with an efficiency that was essentially unchallenged, and he had been an architect of Yehua's isolation for 3 years. It was Wei Bo-ming who had ensured that petitions from her family's house went unanswered, that requests for household budget reviews were lost in procedural loops, that the Zilan courtyard's maintenance complaints were perpetually deprioritized. He was, in short, a man of genuine and accumulated power who had made himself so comfortable in that power that he'd stopped being careful. 3 weeks after the autumn banquet, Wei Bo-ming submitted to the emperor's review an administrative proposal recommending that the crown prince's household budget be reduced by 40%, reclassified from a Tier 1 imperial household to a Tier 2 supplementary household, on the grounds that recent audit had revealed administrative irregularities in the crown prince's household accounts. The audit had been commissioned by the Chancellor's office. The irregularities had been inserted into the records by the Chancellor's office. The proposal, if approved, would strip Cheng Jin's household of the financial standing that entitled him to certain ceremonial prerogatives, including the right to appear at the Hall of 10,000 Ancestors during formal succession ceremonies. It was not a killing blow, it was a crippling one, the kind that limits range of movement until the final blow becomes easy. I saw the proposal before the emperor did. Lao Feng had a very old friendship with the document courier who moved between the Chancellor's administrative office and the imperial secretariat, and this friendship was worth, in practical terms, approximately a 12-hour window of advance notice on anything moving through that channel. 12 hours was enough. I sent for imperial physician Gu Xiaoming. He was a small, precise man of about 50 who had served the imperial household for 22 years and whose loyalty was a quiet and undeclared thing. It had no announcement, no ceremony, but Lao Feng knew it, and Lao Feng's knowledge of people was the most reliable record I had access to. Physician Gu had been the late Empress's personal
Physician. He had been present at Qingjin's birth. He had, over the past 3 years, submitted 11 requests through proper channels for improved medical provision to the Crown Prince's courtyard, all 11 of which had been processed through the Chancellor's office, and all 11 of which had been denied. He came to the Zilan courtyard in the early morning, quietly, through the back entrance that Lao Feng had shown me in the second week. I showed him the Chancellor's proposal. I showed him, alongside it, a document I had spent 4 days preparing, a compiled account of the 11 denied medical provision requests, cross-referenced with the household budget records from which Lao Feng had sourced them, and annotated with a secondary record, sourced through the merchant Lao Feng had identified months earlier, of medicinal compounds purchased through Consort Wrong's household network that bore no medical record of application, suggesting they had not been used for treatment. The compounds were consistent with the range of slow accumulation substances used in the kind of long-duration court poisoning that produces symptoms indistinguishable from natural decline. I did not say who the target of those compounds had been. I did not need to. Physician Gu read the document with the still, focused attention of a man reading a diagnosis, and when he finished reading, he sat for a moment with his hands folded on his knees, and then he looked at me. "This has been assembled very carefully," he said. "Yes," I said. "You will need a witness of sufficient rank to present it." "I have one," I said. I looked at him. "I need a second one." He looked back at me. 22 years of imperial service, 11 denied requests, 1 dead empress he had not been able to save. "Tell me what you need," he said. The Emperor's review of the Chancellor's proposal was scheduled for the 2nd day of the 10th month in the Jade Dragon Court, which was the formal setting for administrative reviews of significant household standing. It was attended by the Emperor, the Chancellor, the senior household officials, and 3 imperial advisors, and the Empress. I had not attended an administrative review in 18 months. My presence was not irregular. It was within the prerogatives of the Empress to attend any proceeding touching on household matters, but it was unexpected, and I could see the Chancellor process my presence when I entered with the particular micro-expression of a man updating a threat calculation. I took my seat. I folded my hands on the table, and I looked at the Emperor, who looked back at me with a slightly uncertain quality that I had been observing in him for weeks, an uncertainty that had been growing, I thought, since the autumn banquet. He was a man being slowly presented with a version of events that did not match the version he had been given for 3 years, and the dissonance was beginning to show. Chancellor Wei Boming presented his proposal with the practiced authority of a man who has never been genuinely challenged in 30 years of service. He spoke for 20 minutes. His figures were polished. His administrative logic was internally consistent. He was, I thought, probably one of the most capable bureaucratic operators I had ever encountered, and if he had not chosen to align his capabilities with a faction that intended to murder a child, I might have found him professionally admirable. When he finished, he set the proposal on the table with the air of a man placing a stone on a board game. Final, immovable. The Emperor looked at it, then at me. "The Empress wishes to speak?" "With His Majesty's permission," I said. He nodded. I stood. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way I had learned, in 5 months of watching Lao Feng move through this court, to speak, at precisely the register that required silence to be heard. "This proposal," I said, "references an audit conducted by the Chancellor's office. I would like to enter for the review record the original household accounts from which this audit drew its figures." I set the documents on the table. These sourced, cross-referenced originals Lao Feng had obtained. The audit as presented reflects a selective reading of those accounts. The figures cited as irregularities in the Chancellor's proposal are, in context, standard household administrative carryovers, the accounting treatment for which is defined in the Imperial Household Code, Section 14, Paragraph 3. I paused. I would be happy to read that section aloud if the Chancellor's office requires it. A silence. Wei Boming looked at the documents, then at me. "Additionally," I said,
I would like to enter a secondary document, prepared by Imperial Physician Gu Xiaoming, detailing 11 requests for enhanced medical provisions submitted to this office over the past 3 years, all of which were denied without explanation. I set the physician's document beside the first. These denials constituted
Not only an administrative irregularity, but a potential endangerment of an imperial heir, which, under the Imperial Household Code, Section 22, is a matter of formal record. Another pause. I believe the Records Office will wish to note that the denial authorizations bear Chancellor Wei's personal chop. The room was very quiet. Wei Boming's face had gone a particular color, not red, not pale, the color of a man in whom several calculations are occurring simultaneously and none of them are resolving favorably. He was a man who had been powerful long enough to have forgotten what it felt like not to control the information in the room. He looked at the Emperor. The Emperor was reading the physician's document. He read it slowly, with the expression of a man who is hoping the words will change if he reads them carefully enough. They did not change. These denials, the Emperor said. His voice was measured. He was holding it measured. They bear your chop, Chancellor? The administrative process for such requests, Wei Boming began, was evidently insufficient, I said pleasantly, given the outcome. I sat down. I did not look at Chancellor Wei Boming after that. I looked at the table in front of me, calm and still, and let the room carry what it was carrying. Physician Gu, seated at the witness table, looked at no one, his hands folded in his lap, quiet as an inkstone. The review was suspended pending an independent audit of the Chancellor's office. Wei Boming walked out of the Jade Dragon Court that morning, still holding his title, still holding his position. He would hold them for another 4 months, but the ground beneath them had shifted, irrevocably, by a degree that a man of his experience would have recognized. He had been comfortable for too long. That comfort was gone now, and it does not come back. Not really, not once a room full of senior officials has watched you be reduced to a man who needs to check his own files before speaking. I walked out of the Jade Dragon Court behind him and did not watch him go. In the corridor, the Emperor fell into step beside me. This surprised me. The Emperor did not informally approach the Empress in corridors as a general rule of court propriety, but he walked beside me for a moment, and then he said, without looking at me directly, in the tone of a man saying something he has thought about and not said for a long time, "I am told he has been studying well." "Exceptionally," I said. "He will be a good emperor." A pause. "Yes," the Emperor said, and turned left. I turned right and walked back toward the Xilon courtyard through the cool corridor and thought about a man who sat alone in the Hallow of Ancestors and what it was that he was sitting with, and whether it was grief or guilt or both, and whether it mattered. Both, I thought. Both. Lao Fang was waiting in the outer chamber when I arrived. He took one look at my face and said, "It went well." The first part went well. Consort wrong is still standing. I sat down. I was tired in the way that sustained precision makes you tired, not dramatically, just a deep, quiet exhaustion of maintained control. What is she doing? As of an hour ago, Lao Fang said, she had sent for a calligrapher. He paused, letting this settle. The ancestor acknowledgement ceremony, he said. She intends to challenge the Crown Prince's standing at the ceremony. The ancestor acknowledgement ceremony was held every 5 years. At the new year, it was the proceeding at which the imperial family formally affirmed succession standing before the clan ancestral record, the single event at which the legitimacy of an heir could be formally contested before the full assembly of Shio clan nobility. It was 3 months away. And I had, sewn into a child's winter robe, exactly the thing that would answer whatever challenge Consort Wrong intended to bring. I sat back. I let the exhaustion be there for a moment without fighting it. 3 months, I said. 3 months, Lao Fang agreed. I thought of Cheng Jin, of his wolf hair brushes and his precise calligraphy, and the way he had said, "I already trust you," as though it was a small thing. I thought of a letter traveling north and a general who had not yet been called. Then we have 3 months, I said, to make sure that when she brings whatever she is planning, there is nothing left standing after it, not the plan, not the faction, not the ground she built it on. I stood, starting with what the calligrapher is being hired to write. Lao Feng nodded. He moved toward the door, then paused. Your Majesty, he said. I looked at him. The late Empress, he said slowly, would not have thought of the physician's document. She would not have thought to prepare it 4 days in advance and enter it as a second instrument. He looked at me steadily. She was a good woman, and she would have fought hard for her son, but she would have been too straightforward for this court. A pause. You are not too straightforward for this court. I did not know what to say to that. I was not Ruan Wenshu. I had not earned the comparison, but I understood what he was offering, and I accepted it for what it was. Not a compliment, but a recognition. A witness saying, I see what you are doing, and I believe in it. Go find out about the calligrapher, I said. He left. I stood alone in the outer chamber of the Zelan courtyard, in the room with the cracked walls and the faded peony screen, and I listened to the palace settle around me, the distant bells, the wind in the pine trees, and the muffled sounds of a court that had been watching me for 5 months and was beginning, finally, to be afraid. Good, I thought. 3 months. The calligrapher's name was Shen Bo Qi, and he was not from the city. Lao Feng found this out within a week, not through dramatic means, but through the patient, unglamorous work of knowing which tea house the palace's external couriers used, and which courier made the trip to Consort Rong's pavilion's side gate on the evening in question, and which village outside the eastern city wall that courier had traveled from before his career in palace adjacency began. Shen Bo Qi was from that village. He was 53, a scholar who had failed the imperial examinations 4 times and supported himself through the writing of documents for families who needed things made official: land transfers, inheritance records, ancestral lineage registers. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man you hire when you need something to look old. A lineage document, I said when Lao Feng told me. Almost certainly, he said. The ancestor acknowledgement ceremony requires the submission of the Crown Prince's lineage record to the Clan Council for verification. The original record is held in the Bureau of Imperial Ancestry. It cannot be altered there. The Bureau's security is independent of the Chancellor's office. A pause. But a secondary document, submitted as supplementary evidence by a noble house with standing before the Clan Council, can challenge the primary record. If that document appears old, bears appropriate seals, and is supported by testimony, she's going to claim Cheng Jin isn't the emperor's son, I said. The room was quiet. A posthumous slander against the late Empress Ruan Wenshu, something to the effect that the child was not of the incurial bloodline. I thought about it, turning the shape of it in my mind the way you turn a locked box, feeling for the mechanism. She would need a witness. Someone who could claim to have known something, kept silent out of loyalty, now coming forward for the sake of the dynasty's integrity. I looked at Lao Feng. Who is she going to use? That, Lao Feng said carefully, is what I have not yet been able to determine. I determined it 11 days later, and the answer was the one I had not prepared for. Lao Feng came to the Zelan courtyard at the second watch, which was unusual enough that I was already sitting up when he entered, the lamp still burning. He stood in the doorway with an expression I had not seen him before. Not alarm, because Lao Feng did not alarm, but something close to the weight of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally decided it cannot be carried any further. He sat down without being invited, which he had done only once before. There is something I have not told you, he said. I did not tell you because I was not certain it was provable, and an unprovable accusation is a dangerous weapon for the hand that carries it. But Consort Rong has made it provable by choosing this particular path, and you need to know it before the ceremony. I said nothing. I waited. The late Empress did not die of complications, not naturally. He folded his hands on his knees.
She was given something in the weeks before the birth that weakened the lining of her womb. The hemorrhage that killed her was not unforeseeable. It was engineered, slowly, carefully, over the course of 4 months, through her dietary supplements, which were prepared by a physician who was not Imperial Physician Gu. The lamp flame was very still, no draft in the room, everything quiet. Consort Rong entered the palace 14 months before Chengjin was born. Yes, she had not yet secured the emperor's favor, she had no son, she had no position of permanence. I worked through it steadily. If the empress died in childbirth, the emperor would be without an empress and without an heir. He had no other children yet. The path would be open. Yes, and if the child also died— The child did not die, Lao Feng said. That was the one thing she could not control. The child was stronger than she had calculated, or the dosage insufficient, or both. A pause. Chengjin survived, and his survival changed her plans from a clean opening to a decade of management. I sat with this. 8 years old. He was 8 years old, and he had been a target since before he could speak, since before he was born. His mother had been killed by the same woman who was now attempting to erase him from the ancestral record. I kept my face still and my breathing even, because this was not the moment for feeling things. The moment for feeling things would come later, in private, where no one needed me to be composed. Right now, I needed to be composed. The physician, the one who prepared the supplements, dead, 3 months after the late Empress died. A fever, very sudden. Of course, I thought for a moment, but if Consort Rong is now producing a witness for the ceremony, someone to testify that the late Empress was unfaithful, that witness knows something about that period, about the Empress's personal life. They were close enough to be plausible. I looked at Lao Feng. Who was close to the late Empress in the year before she died? Lao Feng was quiet for a moment. Her personal attendant, he said, a woman named Pei Ju. She left imperial service after the late Empress died. She was given a resettlement payment from the Consolation Fund, and she returned to her home province. He paused. The Consolation Fund disbursements were managed by the Chancellor's office. I looked at him. She has been living in the eastern province for 8 years on a stipend that does not appear in any record I've been able to access, paid through a merchant intermediary. Another pause. The merchant is the same one you had me document for the medicinal compound records. Everything connected. It always does in the end. The careful plans of careful people leave careful traces, and traces are what you build a case from. Pei Ju is coming to the ceremony as Consort Rong's witness. I believe so. Then we need to speak with Pei Ju before the ceremony. Lao Feng nodded slowly. He has already located her, he said. She is in the city. She arrived 4 days ago. He looked at me steadily. She is not, I think, a willing participant. The stipend bought her silence for 8 years. I do not think she anticipated being asked to do something more. I thought about a woman who had loved her mistress, who had watched her mistress die of something that looked like natural causes, and was paid afterward to say nothing and go away. 8 years of saying nothing in an eastern province with a stipend that kept her comfortable and a knowledge that kept her isolated. Being summoned now to the capital to testify to something she knew was a lie. I will speak with her myself. I will not recount that conversation in full. It belongs to Pei Ju, not to this telling. She was 50, quiet, with the weathered composure of a woman who has kept a terrible secret long enough that it has become part of her physical posture, a weight she carried in her posture.
Shoulders, in the set of her jaw. She received me in the modest guest-house room she had been given near the outer palace district, and she stood when I entered with the automatic deference of a woman who had spent 20 years in imperial service, and then she saw my face and sat back down and said nothing at all. I told her that I knew what had happened to the late Empress.
I told her that consort Rong had brought her to the capital to lie before the clan council, and that if she did, the lie would eventually be disproved, because I had the evidence to disprove it, and she would be held accountable as a witness who had committed perjury before the ancestral record. I told her that I was offering her a different path. She cried, once, briefly, with her hands pressed flat on her knees. Then she stopped and pressed her lips together and nodded. "She was good to me," Peju said, meaning the late Empress. "She was always good to me. I knew it wasn't right, the sickness. I knew it wasn't—" She stopped. "There was nothing I could do. And then afterward they gave me the money and I thought it was finished." "It is almost finished," I said. "One more thing and it will be." General Rong Cheng-hao arrived on the 12th day of the 11th month, which was 18 days before the ceremony. He came not as a general, not with a military escort or an official declaration, but as a private citizen, traveling under a secondary name, accompanied by 4 men who looked like merchants and were not. Lao Feng arranged his lodging in the outer city. I met him in a private room in the administrative wing of the palace, in the early morning, before the assembly bells. He was 45, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have spent 30 years on the northern frontier, with the late Empress's dark eyes, and a stillness about him that was different from court stillness, not performed, not strategic, simply the composure of a man accustomed to making decisions in difficult terrain where second-guessing costs lives. He looked at me for a long time when I entered. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No one is," I said. He had read my letter. He had read, via the channels Lao Feng had opened, the materials I had assembled over the past 5 months. He sat across from me in that small room and listened as I laid out the final architecture, what consort Rong intended to bring to the ceremony, what I intended to answer with, and what I needed from him. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. "My sister," he said. Not a question, processing. "I am sorry," I said. He looked at his hands, which were resting flat on the table. Then he looked up. "The boy is well?" "He is well. He is more than well." I paused. "He is the kind of child his mother would have recognized." Rong Cheng-hao breathed in slowly through his nose, held it, released it. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. The ancestor acknowledgement ceremony was held on the first day of the 12th month in the Hall of 10,000 Ancestors, which was the oldest building in the Crimson Phoenix Palace, low-ceilinged, stone-floored, hung with the ancestral portraits of 15 generations of the Shao clan in their red and gold frames. The hall smelled of sandalwood and thyme. The light came through high latticed windows, falling in pale strips across the stone. The full clan council attended, 47 nobility of Shao blood, ranging from the emperor's uncles to minor branch cousins 2 generations removed. The senior imperial officials attended. The household administrators attended. Consort Rong attended, in deep burgundy, close to imperial red, but not quite, the color of a woman who has decided this is the day she stops being close and becomes the thing itself. Cheng Jin attended in his formal robes, standing at the position designated for the crown prince, 3 paces to the emperor's left. He was 8 years old, and he stood with the uprightness of someone who has decided that uprightness itself is a form of resistance. He did not look at me when I took my position, but I saw from across the hall his hands loose at his sides, not clenched, not rigid, and I knew he had steadied himself the way I had taught him, by deciding in advance that whatever happened, he would not flinch. I told him the night before, "Trust me, you will not need to do anything except stand where you are standing and be exactly who you are." He had looked at me and said simply, "I know." An old man of about 70, named Shao Puyen, who moved with the stately deliberateness of a man who has conducted this ceremony twice before and intends to conduct it correctly regardless of anything else that occurs around him.
It was after the succession register was read that supplementary evidence could be presented. This was the procedural window consort Wrong had prepared for. She presented it with full ceremony, as was her right as a noble consort of the first rank. She rose from her position, bowed to the clan council, and said in a voice calibrated for the acoustics of the hall that she came forward with great reluctance, out of duty to the dynasty rather than any personal motivation, to present evidence that bore upon the legitimacy of the crown prince's succession standing. The document Shenbo Qi had prepared was brought forward in a lacquered box, as though its age warranted preservation. Elder Xiao Puyen accepted it. 2 council members leaned to examine it. It looked old. It was old, technically. Shenbo Qi had used appropriately aged paper and ink prepared to the correct oxidation, a craft that took a lifetime of failed examinations to perfect. It was a personal letter, purportedly written 8 years ago by a lady of the inner court, alleging that the late Empress Ran had conducted a secret correspondence with a northern military officer, and that the crown prince's parentage was uncertain. Then consort Rong called her witness. Pei Ju entered from the eastern door, which was where the witness entrance was located, and walked to the center of the hall in the slow, careful manner of a woman who was managing her own courage step by step. She wore plain gray, nothing notable. She stopped at the witness position and bowed to the council elder. Elder Xiao Puyen said, "The witness will state her name and former position." "This person is Pei Ju," she said. Her voice was very clear. "Formerly personal attendant to Empress Ran of the Hung-Fua dynasty." A murmur through the hall. The witness was summoned by noble consort Rong's household to offer testimony relevant to the document submitted, Elder Xiao Puyen said. "The witness will speak." Pei Ju stood very straight. She looked at the council elder. She did not look. An old man of about 70, named Xiao Puyen, who moved with the stately deliberateness of a man who has conducted this ceremony twice before and intends to conduct it correctly regardless of anything else that occurs around him. It was after the succession register was read that supplementary evidence could be presented. This was the procedural window consort Wrong had prepared for. She presented it with full ceremony, as was her right as a noble consort of the first rank. She rose from her position, bowed to the clan council, and said in a voice calibrated for the acoustics of the hall that she came forward with great reluctance, out of duty to the dynasty rather than any personal motivation, to present evidence that bore upon the legitimacy of the crown prince's succession standing. The document Shenbo Qi had prepared was brought forward in a lacquered box, as though its age warranted preservation. Elder Xiao Puyen accepted it. 2 council members leaned to examine it. It looked old. It was old, technically. Shenbo Qi had used appropriately aged paper and ink prepared to the correct oxidation, a craft that took a lifetime of failed examinations to perfect. It was a personal letter, purportedly written 8 years ago by a lady of the inner court, alleging that the late Empress Ran had conducted a secret correspondence with a northern military officer, and that the crown prince's parentage was uncertain. Then consort Rong called her witness. Pei Ju entered from the eastern door, which was where the witness entrance was located, and walked to the center of the hall in the slow, careful manner of a woman who was managing her own courage step by step. She wore plain gray, nothing notable. She stopped at the witness position and bowed to the council elder. Elder Xiao Puyen said, "The witness will state her name and former position." "This person is Pei Ju," she said. Her voice was very clear.
formerly personal attendant to Empress Ran Wenshu of the Hung Hua dynasty. A murmur through the hall. The witness was summoned by noble consort Rong's household to offer testimony relevant to the document submitted, Elder Xiao Puyen said. The witness will speak. Pei Ju stood very straight. She looked at the council elder. She did not look at consort Rong. This person, she said, was summoned to offer testimony in support of the document that has been presented. A pause. The hall was very quiet. The late Empress Ran Wenshu was faithful to the emperor throughout the entirety of her marriage. This person attended her every day for 4 years and will state this before the ancestral record without reservation. This person was paid, after the late Empress's death, to leave imperial service and maintain silence about what this person had observed in the months before that death. This person has maintained that silence for 8 years. This person will not maintain it today. I stood at my position and watched consort Rong's face. It was, for exactly 3 seconds, not a court face. The composure failed, not completely, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for 47 clan nobles and 200 officials to see the thing underneath it, which was the face of a woman realizing that the instrument she had arranged was turned around. Then it closed again. The composure returned. She was extraordinary at it, genuinely. The reconstruction of control in real time. The way she reached for it and pulled it back like a silk curtain across a window. But the window had been open. The room had seen through it. I rose. With the council elder's permission, I said, I would like to submit additional evidence to the ancestral record. Elder Xiao Puyen, who had the expression of a man who has conducted this ceremony twice before, and this was significantly more eventful than either previous time, nodded. I brought 3 things forward. The first was the compiled medical record, the 11 denied requests, the physician's documentation, the medicinal compound purchases. I did not narrate this at length. I simply submitted it to the council elder and said, this documents a pattern of administrative interference with the Crown Prince's household provision, conducted through the Chancellor's office over a period of 3 years. The second was a sealed document from physician Gu Shaoming, imperial physician, 22 years of service, a name the clan council recognized, which stated in the precise language of a medical professional that the late Empress Ran Wenshu's final illness was consistent with the effects of a category of substance that, if administered gradually over a period of months, would produce exactly the hemorrhagic outcome that had occurred, and that this category of substance had been documented available through a supply network connected to the noble consort Rong's household.
I let this sit in the air of the hall for a moment. Then I looked at the emperor. He was reading the physician's document. He was very still. The third item, I said, I would like to present directly to the Crown Prince. This was not procedurally standard. Elder Shapuyen looked at me with the slight surprise of a man recalibrating. I met his eyes calmly, and after a moment he said, "The Empress may proceed." I walked across the hall to where Cheng Jin stood. He looked up at me. His face was composed. The composure I had watched him build over 8 months, the real kind. Not the frightened kind, but the chosen kind, the kind that belongs to someone who has decided to be steady. "Your mother made something for you before you were born," I said quietly, just to him. "I am going to show you where she put it." I reached for the collar of his winter robe, the gold pheasant robe which he had been wearing since the first cold day of the 10th month, which I had ensured was prepared and pressed and waiting, and with 2 careful fingers, along the inner seam at the left shoulder, I found the small raised outline of what had been sewn there for 8 years.
I took the small knife from my sleeve. Lao Fang had given it to me that morning, a delicate thing, a letter opener's blade, and made one precise cut along the seam. The jade token fell into my palm, cool and green and flat, the old emperor's signet cut into its face with the clarity of something made to last, made to matter, made to be found at exactly this moment by exactly the right hands. Beside it, still wrapped in its oilcloth, the folded document. Cheng Jin looked at the jade in my hand, then up at me. "She put it there?" he said. "She put it there," I said. "She wanted you to have it when you needed it." He looked at the jade for a long moment, a child of 8, standing in the hall of 10,000 ancestors, holding the thing his dead mother had made for him before he was born. And his face did something that I will not try too hard to describe, because some things lose their truth in description. An opening and a closing all at once, something that was grief and love and steadiness braided together. Then he stood up straight. I carried the token and the document to Elder Xiao Puyen. He read the document, he examined the token, he passed both to the senior council members beside him. The hall watched in silence as the document traveled down the council table, each elder reading it in turn. Then Elder Xiao Puyen said, in his careful ceremonial voice, "This council recognizes the blood oath of the old emperor, seal verified, witnessed and co-signed by General Ron Jing He of the northern frontier." He looked up. "Under the terms of this oath, the Crown Prince's succession standing of verified imperial blood and documented legitimate birth is affirmed by the full ancestral council. No supplementary challenge may stand." He set the document down. He looked across the hall at Consort Rong, which was not something council elders generally did. They addressed the assembled body, not individuals. But Xiao Puyan was 70 years old and had conducted this ceremony twice before, and he had read a physician's report that stated plainly what had been done to an empress who had been his clan sister by marriage, and he was 70 years old and had stopped being governed by politeness. The supplementary document submitted by noble consort Rong's household is rejected. The clan council reserves the right to refer this matter to the emperor's justice for further investigation. He placed both hands on the table. The crown prince's succession stands. I will not pretend that what followed was tidy. It was not tidy. History rarely is at the moment of its turning. It becomes tidy later, in the retelling, when the chroniclers have smoothed the sequence into something that feels inevitable. At the time, it was loud and complicated, and several clan nobles spoke at once, and Chancellor Wei Boming stood up and attempted to offer a procedural objection that collapsed midway through its second sentence when the council elders simply looked at him, and Consort Rong, I watched this, carefully from across the hall, sat completely still through all of it. She did not speak. She did not defend herself or attempt to reframe the physician's report or challenge the blood oath document. She simply sat, in her burgundy robes, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face was closed, and she looked at nothing. I understood that expression. I had been learning to read faces for 8 months, and I understood what that particular quality of stillness meant. It meant a person who had looked at every remaining move and found that there were none. Not defeat, exactly. Something colder. The recognition of a person who has played every card and watched them all lose.
The emperor called a recess. In the recess, he went to the inner chamber adjacent to the hall, and after a moment, he summoned me. He was standing at the window when I entered, looking out at the winter courtyard, the bare branches of the scholar trees, the gray sky, the stone path dusted with overnight frost. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was accurate, because I knew from Lao Feng that the light in the imperial study had burned until the 5th watch the night before. He did not turn when I entered. He said, to the window, "How long have you known?" "About the late Empress's death," I said, 2 months. "About the rest, I have been assembling it since the beginning of autumn." A long pause. "I did not know," he said, "about Wen Shu.
I want you to know that I did not know." I stood in the middle of the room and looked at his back and thought about what I believed. A man who had lost his Empress to what he thought was a complication of nature, who had mourned and moved on in the way that people move on when they do not know there is something to be angry at. A man who had found warmth and certainty in a woman who was, I thought, genuinely capable of affection, alongside everything else she was capable of. Consort Wrong was not a simple villain, which made her a more successful one. He had not known. "I believe you," I said. He turned from the window. He looked tired, genuinely, not performatively tired, the kind that lives in the lines beside a person's eyes and cannot be arranged away. "Cheng Chen," he said. "He is well," I said. For the third time, I said it. I seemed to keep saying it to him, and perhaps he needed to keep hearing it. "I have not—" He stopped, began again. "I have not been a good father to him." I considered how to answer this. There were several possible answers. The most honest one was also the most useful one. "No," I said, "but you have been one. There is still time to be a better one." I paused. "He is a child of considerable forgiveness. I have observed this. It is something his mother gave him." The emperor was quiet. Then he said, "And you have been—" He seemed to search for the word. "You have been something I did not know also." "I changed," I said simply. "Why?" I looked at him, at the tired eyes, the question that was genuine, not rhetorical, not political, but a man asking because he actually wanted to understand. "Because he needed someone to," I said, "and I was the person who was there." The proceedings that followed the ceremony took the better part of 3 months, which is how these things go when they are done correctly, not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the slow, methodical work of documentation and testimony and institutional process. Consort Wrong was stripped of her rank and confined to the Mingzhu Pavilion pending a full imperial investigation. The investigation, overseen by a tribunal from which the chancellor's office was pointedly excluded, took 11 weeks. At the end of those 11 weeks, it concluded that noble consort Rong Mei Lien had orchestrated the administration of a harmful substance to the late Empress Ruan Wenshu, had maintained a suppressed witness, had commissioned a forged document for use before the ancestral council, and for a period of 3 years directed a sustained campaign of administrative interference against the crown prince's household, including the manipulation of a former empress. She was stripped of her title, her rank, and her household. Her son, the second prince, Xiao Chen Yu, was reassigned to the care of the imperial household proper, and kept in conditions that were appropriate for his rank and age, and not his mother's crimes. He was 4 years old, and nothing about any of this was his fault, and I said so plainly when the question arose, which it did. The second prince was placed, at my request, in the adjacent courtyard to Cheng Qin's. They were half-brothers, and Cheng Qin would one day be emperor, and an emperor who has a brother he knows and trusts is a stronger ruler than one who has a stranger whose resentments he cannot read. Cheng Qin, when I told him this plan, thought about it for a moment and then said, "He likes persimmons. I have seen him eating them." "Most children like persimmons," I said. "He can share mine," he said, as simply as that. Chancellor Wei Bo-ming's case was heard separately. The audit of his office, once initiated by people who were not subordinate to it, produced a document record that bore the quality of a wound opened long after the damage was done. The depth of it was worse than the surface had suggested. 11 years of channeled bribes.
Families who paid and against those who did not. The 11 denied provision requests were the least of it. He was removed from office, his assets reviewed, his household stripped of the hereditary privileges his family had held for 3 generations. His personal seal was collected by the clerk of the Imperial Records Office on a gray morning in the first month, and he was escorted to comfortable but firm retirement in his home province,
where he would spend the remainder of his years in a very large house with a very small circle of influence. It was a restrained sentence by the standards of what he had done. I had argued for restraint, and I will explain why. A disgraced man who lives is a lesson. A dead man is only a story, and stories can be romanticized in ways that lessons cannot. I wanted the court to see Wei Boming alive and diminished and present in his diminishment for years. The emperor agreed with this reasoning, which told me something about him that I added to the growing account I was keeping in my head. General Ruan Changhao stayed in the capital for 6 weeks. He was not officially present. His visit remained, on the record, a private matter of no particular note. He met Cheng Jin 3 times, in the Zilan courtyard, in the early mornings before lessons. I stayed in the outer chamber during these meetings, and did not listen. Not because I was not curious, but because those conversations were not mine. A child meeting the man who was his mother's brother, who had her eyes and her stillness, and something of the frontier in his bearing. That was Cheng Jin's, to have and to keep. On the day Ruan Changhao prepared to leave, he came to find me in the courtyard where the osmanthus tree had lost all its flowers but still held its shape against the winter sky. He asked me what she was like when she was young. I looked at him. He said, I told him she was the kind of person who prepared for what she couldn't control, that she believed the best way to love someone was to make sure they had what they needed to stand on their own. He paused. He said, my stepmother does that. I looked at the bare osmanthus tree. He's not wrong, Ruan Changhao said. He left the next morning before the assembly bells. He would come back. I had made sure of that, had ensured through Lao Feng the establishment of an official channel between the frontier garrison and the crown prince's household, a formal correspondence that would allow Cheng Jin's maternal uncle to be part of his life in the way that geography and court politics had prevented until now. The North needed a general it could trust. The capital needed a crown prince who knew he had people in every direction. In the 2nd month of the new year, the emperor formally reinstated the Empress's household to its original standing. The Zilan courtyard was vacated, not because I had won something, but because the cracked walls and the faded peonies and the distant maintenance had served their purpose, and it was time to move. I stood in the outer chamber of the Zilan courtyard on the last morning, while the handmaidens carried out the last of the boxes, and I looked at the room. The peony screen, the bronze braziers, which had been properly refilled by then, the window above the drainage channel where I had poured out a bowl of poisoned congee on the first morning of this life. I thought about Shen Yuehua, the woman whose body I had borrowed and whose name I carried. She had been frightened and vain and exploited past the point of recognizing the exploitation. She had been a tool that believed itself a hand. I had arrived in her place and found the damage she had done and the damage done to her, and I had tried to make something of both. I hoped, in whatever way hoping across the boundary between one life and another can be said to mean anything, that she would not have objected. I thought she would not have. In the end, the thing she had wanted, to matter, to be seen, to be more than what others made of her, I had delivered it, just not in the way she had imagined. I picked up the last thing remaining on the table, the wolf hairbrush that Chunmei had forgotten to pack, which was not mine, and carried it out with me. Cheng Jin became emperor 12 years later, at the age of 20, when the Honghua emperor died peacefully in his sleep on a winter night in the 17th year of his reign. He had spent the last decade of his life doing something I believe qualified as making amends, not in any dramatic or declared way, but in the patient, consistent way of a man who understood what he failed at and decided to be better at it. He had known his son. He had shown up for the morning lessons sometimes, sitting at the back of the room in the way that I once had done. He and Cheng Jin had developed over years the kind of relationship that doesn't have a name because it is too specific, not easy, not uncomplicated, but real and chosen and sufficient. Cheng Jin did not weep publicly when his father died.
He had learned from his father how to be a private person in the middle of a public life, which is a skill every emperor needs. He came to find me the morning after the funeral, before the official accession ceremonies began, in the garden where the osmanthus tree had been transplanted from the Zealand courtyard.
At his specific request, a small, unnecessary gesture that had mattered more to me than most of the large ones. He was 20 years old, tall, with his mother's dark eyes and his own particular quality of stillness, which was not his mother's or mine or his father's, but something he had assembled himself over years of deciding who he wanted to be. He sat beside me under the osmanthus tree, and we were quiet for a while. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I want my reign to be remembered for." "Oh?" I said. "Not conquest," he said, "not the size of the territory." A pause. "I want people to be able to eat. I want the waterways managed properly so the floods don't take the harvest every 3rd year. I want the examination system reformed so that men like Scholar Gu don't fail 4 times because they can't afford the preparation texts." He was looking at the garden, not at me, speaking the way he spoke when he was thinking rather than performing. "I want the North to be stable enough that children who grow up there don't spend their whole lives at the edge of a war." I thought about General Ruan Cheng Hao, who had come back twice more in the intervening years, and who had become, slowly and without ceremony, a fixture in Cheng Jin's life in the way that family becomes when you let it. "Those are not small ambitions," I said. "No," Cheng Jin agreed. "They are also," I said, "exactly the right ones." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I couldn't have none of this." He stopped, started again more carefully. "The morning you came to my courtyard the first time, I had been told you were coming to look at my calligraphy, and I thought you were there to remind me of something, to make some point." He paused. "And you just looked at the characters and said the brushwork was good." "It was good," I said. "You were the first person who had come to my courtyard in 3 months, just to sit." I did not say anything. The osmanthus tree was bare. It was winter again, the wheel having come fully around, and the branches were the same clean ink stroke against the gray sky that they had been on the morning I had first noticed them. I know I have said thank you before. I know it is not sufficient. I don't think there is a sufficient version of it, so I will just say it again. Thank you. "You were worth it," I said. It came out plain, because it was plain. From the first morning, you were worth it. You never needed me to believe in you. You were already who you were. I thought about how to say it accurately. I held the space steady until you could stand in it yourself. He looked at me sideways, the way he had looked at me since he was 8 years old, and making calculations about whether to trust the thing that was being offered. "You are going to remain insufferably understated about this for the rest of your life, aren't you?" "Yes," I said, "I am." He laughed, a real one, short and unguarded. He had a good laugh. He did not use it often enough. We sat under the winter osmanthus tree until the ceremony bells began their sequence, and then he rose and I rose, and he straightened his robes in the automatic way of someone who has been preparing for this moment their entire life, and I straightened mine. "Ready?" I said. He looked at the palace around him, at the stone and the tile and the bare trees and the winter sky, and something moved through his face that I did not try to name. "Yes," he said, "I've been ready for a long time." He walked toward the hall of 10,000 ancestors, and I walked beside him, and above us the sky was pale and cold and entirely clear, the kind of clarity that comes after a long winter and means, if you know how to read it, that the season is turning. I transmigrated into a wicked stepmother. I was given a child who had been made into a target, a court that had made peace with cruelty, and a body whose reputation had been hollowed out from the inside. I was given no allies and no resources and no welcome.
I was given a fractured inheritance from a woman who had been used as a blade until she broke, and a room with cracked walls and a bowl of poison I chose not to use. And I built. Quietly, carefully, without announcement. I built the way you build things that are meant to last, not in a single dramatic act, but in the accumulated weight of consistent choices, of showing up, of refusing to leave, of understanding that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people performing power is to stop performing and simply be it.
The court had expected a villain. I gave them something they had no category for, a woman who had stopped wanting what they were offering and started building what she could not find. Consort Wrong spent 12 years in a provincial residence, comfortable and irrelevant, which is a fate worse than what she had designed for Qingjin and better than what she deserved for what she had done to his mother. She was not my story to finish. She was her own. And it ended in the only way it could end for a person whose entire architecture was built on other people's destruction. Alone, in a large, quiet house, with nothing to destroy and no one left to be afraid of her. Chancellor Wei Boming died in his home province at 74, which is longer than he deserved, and about what fate tends to award to comfortable men who are merely corrupt rather than cruel. Lao Feng retired from imperial service in the 5th year of Changjin's reign and was given a small house within the imperial palace grounds and an annuity and the title of imperial household elder, which meant nothing administratively and everything personally. It meant the new emperor wanted him close and known and honored by name. He spent his retirement growing osmanthus in pots and occasionally appearing in the corridors at unexpected moments to observe things, which is something I do not think he will ever fully stop doing, and I would not want him to. Chen Mei married a scholar from the Records Bureau and left imperial service at 25 with the settlement I had promised her, and the last I heard she was running a small household in the eastern city with the same methodical competence she had always possessed, directed now entirely at her own life rather than mine. Pei Zhu was given a full pardon and a resettlement from the Imperial Justice Tribunal and returned to her eastern province, and I wrote to her once, simply to say, "What you did in that hall mattered. I hope you know it." She wrote back. One line. It said, "She would have been glad. It always believed in the right ones." I keep the letter. It is the only personal document from that entire period that I have kept. Everything else, the strategy, the evidence, the sealed correspondence, the careful architecture of 5 months of invisible work, belongs to the historical record or the dust. This letter belongs to me. There is no tidy lesson to draw from the shape of a life, because lives do not have the courtesy to be tidy. But if I were to name the thing I understand now that I did not understand when I first stood in a cold chamber holding a bowl I chose to empty out the window, it is this. Power is not the thing they tell you it is. It is not the loudest voice or the most expensive robe or the most connections to the most important rooms. Power is the ability to choose, under pressure, who you are going to be. Everything else, the title, the allies, the careful, patient work, that is just the architecture you build around that choice to give it somewhere to stand. I chose on the first morning not to be the weapon. Everything that followed was just consequence.